Well, it's my privilege this evening to be able to introduce Anita. And as I do that, I'm just going to give a extremely brief history here, but it was amazing or not, 27 years ago that a Twin Cities pastor called me and said, I met someone who needs a book written about her life. And so I got together with Anita and heard her story, and he was right. It deserved to go around the world. And about a year after that, the Tyndale Publishing House accepted the manuscript and literally put it in foreign languages, and it did go around the world. But even way back then, I was aware that there was a post-World War II generation, of which I am one, who was, that era was just too long ago to even think about. And then as we go on, decade by decade by decade, that situation becomes even more critical. That a very significant time in history is being forgotten. I'm referring to World War II, but more specifically to what happened to, 6 million Jews, but millions of others as well. And then as we moved into the 1990s, I began sensing that there was not a new movement, but something that was gaining strength and momentum. And that is what is called the Holocaust denial movement. That it had always been around, but it was picking up steam and picking up steam. And it doesn't help to have the entire Arab world led by Mahmoud Ahmadinejad trumpeting and beating on the never-ending theme that this never happened, or others will say, well, maybe it happened, but the stories that abound are just totally exaggerated. So that's a second reason why this kind of a theme this evening, we just cannot forget it. Now, the London Sunday Times, I just picked this off the internet a couple of days ago. They say this, and I give them credit for reporting it. They say this week the UK removed the Holocaust from its school curriculum because it offended the Muslim population, which claims it never occurred. This is a frightening portent of the fear that is gripping the world and how easily each country is giving into it. And then they go on to say, now more than ever, with Iran among others claiming the Holocaust to be a myth, it is imperative to make sure the world never forgets. Well, that is why I chose to write the book Trapped in Hitler's Hell now so many years ago. And I'm very thankful to a gal named Deborah Dombrowski from Lighthouse Trails, who just 2 years ago, I believe 2.5 years ago, got a hold of an older book and said that she felt it should be updated and have a better look. And then this evening has arranged for Anita to have her testimony taped, which, by the way, I do have it on another DVD, The Holocaust, the Pain and the Praise, which was done about 5 years ago. So this is just going to be just a little bit of an update. Anyway, that is a very brief history of what happened starting 27 years ago. And I can tell you that over the years, again, the book has traveled around the world. Between all the publishers, it sold somewhere between 50 and 100,000 copies. I can't be specific. And Anita, I know, has been privileged to travel all sorts of places and tell her amazing story. And it is amazing. And I'm not going to say any more because she's going to tell it all. So Anita, why don't you come on up and take over for the evening? And I believe there's afterward, there'll be a Q&A time. And then there'll be some fellowship time. And then the book is downstairs.
Before I start out, I want to tip you off. I get very emotional. Typical old lady. I used to tell my mother that she should stop that because it was embarrassing. Now I have the problem myself. But a friend of mine always told me, don't feel bad. Just tell people you have a wet spirit. So I hope you put up with my wet spirit. Before I start my testimony, I want to read from a couple of Bible verses that are very significant. This one has always been my guiding light from Romans 8:28. I know all of you know that probably, but I'll read it again. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. All things, my friends, even the most devastating moments of our life. And you're going to see this verse popping up over and over again when I talk to you. The other one is very unique. It's not too well known. It's from Psalm 119, and it just jumped right into my face when I read it the other day. And it says, the psalmist says, "It is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I might learn thy statutes." That's so unlike us. We flee from affliction. We have all kinds of pills and things that we take to get away from them. And he says, it is good for me. And I echo that. I say too, it was good for me that I was afflicted. I had to pass through 12.5 years of the Nazi Holocaust, and I will admit that physically it has tremendously damaged me, and I've ended up with lots and lots of surgeries, still suffer from it. But this is just a temporary housing anyway. But what it has done for me spiritually, my friends, I would not have wanted to have missed out on one single second of those 12.5 years. I know you probably think it's very odd when you hear my story, but for that, I praise the Lord. I was born in a very large city called Breslau, located in East Germany. It was close to the border of Poland. My mother came from a somewhat Orthodox Jewish background, but when she was 19, like so many of the other people at her age, she renounced her Jewish faith and joined the ranks of the intellectuals of her time. And she started to become very interested in astrology and an Eastern religion called Theosophy. My father, the pure-blooded German, referred to as the Krauts, he was a Gentile, and he was an atheist. Oh, proudly he would proclaim, "Alone I can." Oh, he didn't need God. Religion was for the weak. So since I am a mixture of a Jew and a Kraut, I consider myself a very kosher Kraut. We were very comfortably wealthy. We lived in a wonderful district outside the big city. And but since neither one of my parents believed, my oldest sister and I had absolutely no Christian nurture, but we didn't know what we were missing. We were so comfortably wealthy. And God had blessed me with a wonderful, agile body, and I used to love to dance around and twirl and sing and make merry. So my mother enrolled me in a ballet school, which was taught by a retired ballerina who in her younger years had been very famous. And she tested me, and she looked at me, and she says, "Girl, with your talent and your love for dancing, I'm going to make you into a famous ballerina. It's a wonderful life." And she told me all the perks that I experienced. And at the end, she said, "People will literally worship you." Well, at that age, I didn't know what she was talking about. But I just loved ballet. I lived it. I lived and breathed it. It was wonderful. Life was very easy for the first 5.5 years of my life, but then I came to power, and the scene of my life began to change. Hitler had a grandiose idea. He was going to make Germany into a master race. He called them the Aryans, and he would purify the entire nation of all undesirables. And at the top of the list of the undesirables were the Jewish people. He hated the Jews with a passion. Everybody had to register, and you had to sign either you're Jew or you're an Aryan. I was a little both. So they put me over on the undesirable side. But later on, I was glad, because I said I'd rather be the persecuted than the persecutor. Things began to be very tough as time passed on. And what was the toughest was that my father left us. It was too difficult for him. He had a prestigious job, and he didn't want to be married to a Jew. Also, he had once belonged to the Social Democratic Party, which was Hitler's arch enemy. And so they had two strikes against him. And when he left us, my friends, that wonderful life of earthly splendor came to a sudden halt. And literally overnight, my oldest sister, my mother, and I were transferred into the most devastating poverty you can imagine. A poverty so great, it's hard for me to understand how she could cope with it, especially since she didn't know the Lord. Well, when I started school, things were more difficult because since all the copies of the forms that we filled out were sent to the schools, the teachers quickly knew who the undesirables were. And sometimes that rubbed off on the kids too. First grade wasn't too bad. My teacher was very nice. He was tall, dark, and handsome, and I had a mad crush on him. But second, third, and fourth grade was horrible. My Fräulein Kinzel, she was a super Nazi, and she used every opportunity to degrade me, to lower my grades, to humiliate me. Life was really tough. I remember coming home one time, and little Aryan boys followed me, beat me up, called me Jubret. That was the favorite word. And then I remember a time when I was sitting outside, minding my own business, just waiting for a playmate to come out, and 6 other girls would come. And they surrounded me and beat me up, called me Jubret. And when they beat me up and I cried, they laughed, and then they shook their fists at me and they said, "Go home, Jubret, and remember, if you ever think so much as to hit anybody back, we're going to see to it that you and your mother go to prison." And they could have done so because Hitler not only encouraged, but he demanded of the youngest of the young to even turn their own parents into the Gestapo if the kids heard any kind of anti-sentiment against the Nazis. I have to take a swig. It's just water. Yes, life was tough, but for me, there was always my dancing. And when I danced all my cares away. And it was at the end of first grade. I was still 6 years old when my ballet teacher called me in and she said, "Anita, we're going to start a whole new dance number for you because you're ready to dance solo, by yourself on stage. There's going to be a gala performance and you're going to be one of the dance numbers." And I thought, oh. So we practiced, and when the day came and it was my turn to go on stage, I was terrified when I saw this huge audience all focusing on me. But as soon as the music started and I danced, I just became completely oblivious to my surroundings. I felt that I was floating and I was in a totally different world and nothing out there could touch me. The dance ended and I was overwhelmed by the immense applause of this big audience. Oh, my teacher was very proud of me too. And I knew then that was the beginning of that wonderful life that my teacher had predicted for me. I remember that night when I went to sleep, I was deliriously happy and I was dreaming of wonderful things to come. But the next morning, reality struck. My mother had found a newspaper someplace. And there on the front page was a big article telling about the different dance numbers. And when they came to mine, they said the dance was superbly performed by young Anita Dittmann, far above her age level. But the German people no longer wished to be entertained by a Jew. And in addition, because of our poverty, all the funds had run out. And there was no money left for ballet lessons. And right before my eyes, I saw all my hopes and dreams crumbling into 1,000 pieces. I thought my whole world was falling apart. But my mother taught me early in life, she said, when trouble strikes, don't get swallowed up with self-pity. Well, needless to say, my tears dried and life passed on. It was 2 weeks later that my friends who lived upstairs, I'm not mentioning any denomination, that my friends who lived upstairs invited me to their church on a wonderful Sunday morning. And as I went in there, I had never been inside a church. I had never really heard a lot about Jesus. I wasn't really looking for him. But as I sat down and I watched the rays of the morning sun illuminating the stained glass windows, I became totally transfixed looking at it. And these windows depicted Christ's birth, life, death, and resurrection. It was as though Christ stepped out of those windows, and he has walked with me ever since. He came into my heart, and I was so thrilled. I was excited, and I felt a security inside of me that I had never known before. I raced home with my friends. I wanted to share that with my older sister and my mother, but when I got there and told them about it, they just shrugged it off like a childish fantasy. Oh, my heart just ached. I attended more services with my friends, and I learned to pray, and I started to pray for my mother and my older sister. Pretty soon, we not only had heard about the Gestapo and the SS and the brown shirts, we had seen people marching on the street, men, women, and children dressed in uniform, waving the Nazi flag, and out of all the Aryan windows, the Nazi flag was flying. But then we learned a new word, concentration camp. We heard about it, Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Treblinka, Dachau, and so forth. Life became more insecure. Our poverty became more stringent, and the persecution of the Jews became escalated on a daily basis. It was now almost the beginning of 1938. I was ready to go to fifth grade, which is high school in Germany. I had to pass several stiff entrance examinations. I passed them well. I prayed a lot. And I was very blessed to go to parochial school, where I was treated like a human being, where I was kindly and gently approached, no humiliations, nothing. And most of the kids weren't in the Hitler Youth group movement yet. It was wonderful. It was like an oasis. And during that year, we were introduced to a pastor from an inner city church who belonged to a confessional movement like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Niemöller that was very much under persecution by Adolf Hitler. And because of his not selling out to the Nazis, as so many churches did, he was already on the blacklist of the local Gestapo. But then to reach out to the Jews, he had a love for the Jews, and he invited us to his church, and there were many others that came to the church. He didn't force us, but after a few months of Bible study and church, my mother accepted Christ in her life, and so did some of the others. It was the greatest day for me. I tell you, I get very, very emotional because it was so wonderful. At last, after many years, she could understand how I felt. And she used to say to me, how can I be so blind? How could I be so stupid? You accepted him as a little child. I said, don't look back. Just be thankful. You got him now. My sister never accepted Christ in her life. She just pretended on the surface. We got a notification from the Gestapo that we have to leave our very meager but clean little living quarters in the outskirts of the city and move into the inner city Jewish ghetto, a horrible place, a 200-year-old brownstone building with about, I think, 3 or 4 stories. 4 families, my friends, shared one apartment, each family residing in one room. We shared a small bathroom, a small kitchen. It could have been very chaotic, but we learned to accept each other's schedules and needs. But what was horrible, this was now the beginning of 1939. We had already passed through the November 8th, 1938 Kristallnacht, the burning of the synagogues and people being dragged, old men were being dragged out by their beards and hauled off into concentration camps. Some returned, some didn't. So now this is what was looming above us. We were so concerned that any day there could be that knock at the front door that was always followed up, and the door would be open by two men in his S uniform marching in, grabbing either one person out of the family or an entire family. And they were literally hauled away like cattle to the slaughter. Oh, how we prayed that the Lord would watch over us. And one morning, our pastor surprised us. He told us that he had already gotten the ball rolling. He had got in touch with an organization in Berlin that would help the three of us to go to England. And he said, they're really working at it now, and we should soon hear from them. Oh, we prayed that the Lord would hasten, that the visa would come. And we had to raise some of the money, but our pastor was promising us to help us too. The church would, and also the organization would help some monetarily. Well, lo and behold, it was summer vacation for me, and the mailman brought the big envelope from England, and in it we thought were our 3 visas, but it was only my sister's visa. But we were reassured by the organization pretty soon our visas would be coming too. On August 31st, we escorted my sister to the railroad station, where she began her journey by train over the border into Holland and then by boat to England. And we promised her that any day we would be reunited with her. But you know what? That day never came for my mother and me, because the next day, September 1st, 1939, all the borders were closed to any kind of traffic that would go out of the country, nor was any foreign mail allowed into the country. And with that, my friends, my mother's visas and mine were lost, and we were literally trapped in Hitler's hell. And to top it off, Hitler had closed all the parochial schools, and I had to go back to the state schools where I would face renewed persecution. However, you see, I was glad to get an education. And there were a couple of teachers that were nice, and I got a couple of friends that were very kind to me. But this didn't last very long either. Because when I was 15 years old, the principal of my school walked into my classroom and said, Dittmann, pack up all your things, come out in the hall, and I have something to show you. And he handed me a writing from the Gestapo informing me that due to my Jewish heritage, I was permanently suspended from school. And he added to it, he said, it's high time that the Germans are cleansing our school system of riffraff such as yourself. And 2 or 3 months later, I was drafted into very, very heavy factory labor. It was called forced slave labor. But the only good thing was I worked there with my mother and other people that we had known from our church. We worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. The labor was hard. I was always very athletic, and it showed. And my boss looked at me and he says, you're able to carry 100 pounds by yourself, and that's what you're going to be doing. And I remember some days I did that 24 times. And our food wasn't a balanced diet by any means. After 10 days of hard work, after 10 hours of hard work, we would take the streetcar ride home, and then we stood in line for a whole hour to get our food rations because we didn't have refrigeration. However, even the Germans stood in line too. We're not the only ones. But we didn't care. We didn't care how hungry we were, how hard we worked, or what. We were just thankful that we're not yet in a concentration camp, because my mother had already lost all her sisters and brothers, and I had lost many of my beloved friends that I had grown to love. So we were just grateful to still be, at least we were able to go to church on Sunday. And we called that time our oasis and our refueling station for our soul, because it gave us the necessary strength to cope the horrible circumstances that lay ahead of us. And our pastor told us one day, they said, Hilda and Anita, even if a death camp is going to be the ultimate for you, remember, death is but the door to eternal life. And we hung on to that. Yes, my friends, life was tough, and yet we never ever thought that the Lord had forgotten us or that he was punishing us for something. We remained trusting in the Lord. That's the only way to live, no matter how tough things get. One morning it was the 7th of January, 1944. There was again that familiar knock at the front door when my mother and I were just about getting ready to go to work. It was the crack of dawn. And when my mother opened the door, 2 SS men marched in, grabbed her by the collar of the coat, pushed her back into the room and set her down hard. And she had to sign that form that every item in that room was her property. They put red labels on each one, and they informed me that now this is going to be the property of the state, and that the next day the movers would come from the Gestapo and take everything that had a red label on it to the headquarters of the Gestapo warehouse. And if I wanted anything back, I would have to purchase it back at greatly inflated prices. I didn't make enough money to do that. How was I going to do that? The only thing I was allowed to keep was my clothes, my very personal belongings, and my bed. Well, my mother had just enough time to hand me a piece of paper where there was a phone number, and she whispered to me, "That's your father's phone number." See, the marriage had been dissolved a few years prior. My father had remarried and lived in a different city. And she whispered to me, "You call him and I think he'll help you." And he did come the next day and he helped me to keep the things. At first, I didn't know where they had taken my mother. And when I found out that she was taken to Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia, and oddly enough, almost unheard of, they were allowed to receive some food packages occasionally. Well, I didn't know how could I afford to feed her and me at the same time. And I wasn't rich enough to buy food on the black market as some of the rich people could do. But I also remembered, and I want you young kids to listen very carefully what I have to say. In those days when I was a kid, we didn't take our parents for granted. And we weren't taught that we don't owe our parents anything, that everything is just for us. No. It was not that kind of a philosophy then. And I realized that for 16 years, my mother had made so many sacrifices on my account. Now it was time for me to reciprocate. So what I'm sharing with you now is I'm not blowing my own trumpet how good I was. No, I merely figured this is what I should do. I went on my knees and I pleaded with God. I said, "Lord, you know, I'll be very glad to share almost all my food with my mother and keep a fraction. But I pray to you, keep me strong, keep me going so I can continue to do this." And you know what he did for me? I was slender to begin with. I worked very hard. I ate no more each day for 7 months. Every day I would have a piece of bread in the morning. I'd drink a cup of what you call postum coffee, imitation coffee. And I would then work all day, just drink water. And when I'd come home, I'd have a watery soup, or if I was lucky, a bowl full of lettuce. And that's how I lived. And you know, I never lost an ounce of weight. I remained totally untouched by all the epidemics around me. I showed no signs of malnutrition, and I had enough energy to give away. Oh, my stomach growled sometimes, but it just was nothing compared to the joy when I would receive a little card 10 days after I would send off a package. And my mother would thank me for the parcel, and she was clever enough to list every item that was in the package to let me know that nothing had been stolen out of them, because it was a known factor that often the Nazi guards, they were well fed, but just out of nastiness, they would steal out of those packages. And among other things, I always put in a loaf of the real nice dark German rye bread, a kind of a pumpernickel. Our bread is different than yours here. And those of you that have traveled to Germany, you know, the bread is so solid you could almost sit on it without making a dent into it. But one morning, I had been alone now for about 6 months. I had this weird notion when I got up, I'm not going to get the diet bread today. I'm going to get Zwieback, which is toast. And I got a big package, and I wrapped it up with all the other food. And I couldn't figure out, why am I doing it? Is the starvation getting to my brain? Am I going crazy? What's going on? Only to find out 10 days later. Now, this will blow your mind. 10 days later, I got a card from my mother that she had been stricken with dysentery and that she thanked me for the zwieback. She couldn't eat the dark bread. And she had knelt by her cot at night and prayed to God and said, Lord, please convey to Anita to send me zwieback. Now, isn't that something? I said, that's a hotline to heaven. And you know, that hotline is still open. And I read in my daily devotional something cute underneath, and it said, if you call on God and he puts you on hold, don't be impatient. Don't hang up. Well, she recuperated, and I continued to send the dark bread. Well, now it was August 9th, 1944, 7 months after they had picked up my mother. And when I came home from work, I found a letter from the Gestapo, and I opened it, and it informed me, again, due to my Jewish heritage, I was supposed to report the next morning at the main railroad station, and I would be shipped off to an unknown destination with about 300 or 350 other my own racial background. Well, at least I had some time to think. And my main worry was, how am I going to let my mother know? So again, I went on my knees and said, Lord, show me what I'm going to do. I don't know. How am I going to let her know? And sure enough, he came to my rescue right away. And I ran to a grocery store that was still open. And I picked up a big loaf of dark bread, real solid, and it had a red label, company label, the Schlüter Company. And I brought it home. I trimmed the label off very carefully, stuck a knife way down into the bread. Then I rolled up a note and stuffed it in there. And I put the label back on, but you couldn't tell that I'd ever removed it before. And I prayed over the loaf. I said, Lord, please protect this loaf, that it doesn't fall into the hands of a Nazi guy, because if it would, and he would have found the note, they would have killed my mother. A friend of mine shipped off the loaf the next day. She didn't go to camp. You know, 7 months later, I found out that for the very first time, that bread had arrived totally covered with a thick layer of fresh green mold. The Lord placed it there because the Nazi guys didn't need to eat moldy bread. But my mother, in turn, was so starved that she scraped all the mold off, sliced the bread, and this is how she found the note. I said, isn't God fantastic? Oh, this is just the beginning. More is to come. Well, my campsite was not a luxury liner, I can tell you this. It was several miles north of my hometown. About 150 women were housed in a filthy old cow barn that had never been cleaned out. It was covered with a thick layer of fresh straw. We were each given a gray blanket. They called them horse blankets because they used to cover horses and cows with them. Our toilet facility was an open ditch, probably the length of this row of chairs, or maybe not quite. It had a funny contraption over it, looked like a sawhorse, and that's where we could sit. And no walls, no protection from the element, no privacy. That was our toilet facility. Our washing facility was one faucet outside the barn with cold water. So the authorities issued us little enamel pans, the kind of the size of a dishpan, only round, and that was supposed to be for our daily bath. And we had to share this bowl with several others, so we had to take turns. The men lived under similar circumstances, just a little distance from us in an old horse stable. There were a couple or three married couples in the camp. They weren't allowed to live together, but they could work together. We were awakened at 4 o'clock in the morning. Of course, this was August. It was very hot. We were allowed to wear shirts and shorts and heavy shoes. We were awakened at 4. We stood in line to be counted and recounted and to listen to all the insults that they hurled at us. And then they gave us a piece of bread and a cup of that coffee. And then we were marched off. They loaded us up with digging equipment, shovels, spades, and picks, and off we went. We marched for probably an hour and came to our place of work. And we were told that we should feel so privileged that we are now working for the Reich. The Reich was the country. Privileged, yeah. And we were going to be digging ditches. I'm 5 feet tall. The ditches were probably about 7 or 8 feet deep, about 10, 15 feet wide, and several kilometers long. Were supposed to be used as tank traps in case the Russians would invade the country. Although Hitler was always saying, "We're Siegen," that means we're winning, you know. Yeah. And well, after we are done digging ditches, I mean, most of the time we didn't get anything to eat. We just got a sip of water. We were not allowed to speak to each other while we were digging, but those of us that were Christians, naturally we couldn't keep our mouths shut. So when the guard was looking, we would witness to each other, so we found out who the Christians were. After 8 to 10 hours of hard work, we marched home with our digging equipment, and then we stood in line for a whole hour or longer to get our watery soup. We each one had a little enamel pot with a handle and a spoon. It was nothing nourishing, but at least it was hot and it filled our stomachs temporarily. And then they gave us a piece of bread, and that's supposed to be for our breakfast the next day. And we didn't have any place to put the bread, so we put them on the rafters that were the boards that they had put up for shelves. And in the morning we wake up and the rats had come and devoured the bread and left the little calling cards. So we got smart, then we put them in our suitcases or knapsacks. Well, it went that way day after day after day. Well, our little band of Christians grew and it was beautiful. We prayed for one another. Finally, all the ditches were dug and we were ready to be shipped off to a different campsite, little ways from where we were, and winter had come. It was tough, very tough, because we were fighting the winter elements. Sometimes we would be working out in the forests. We were cutting trees. It was very heavy labor. We got cold. Many people contracted bladder and kidney trouble from the cold. Sometimes it would be snowing, and we would walk home in the snow, work in the snow too, and there was no place to dry our clothes, and we would put the wet clothes on the next day, and you can imagine what that did to our bodies. Also, because of lack of sanitation, we contracted head lice from one another, and it took the authorities days and days to get some medication. And I know my hair was long and blonde and thick, but at that time it had gotten thinner because the malnutrition had made the hair fall out. And then, of course, the medication that we finally got to get rid of the lice also got rid of some of the hair. By that time, we had learned that as soon as all our work was completed, we were going to be shipped to Auschwitz to be cremated. So no matter how many lice crawled on our heads, no matter how cold we were just grateful that we weren't in Auschwitz yet. On the 23rd of January 1945, we were all ordered outside at 10 o'clock in the evening. It was a very, very cold day, very overcast, no light from the moon, nothing. And there was a forest right near our camp. And some people were going to escape that night. And they begged me to come with them. They said we could hide in Breslau someplace. We knew a place where we could hide. But they were seen. They didn't think they were going to be seen. And I found out after the war that all of them had been killed because our Nazi guards radioed the Gestapo in my hometown, and they were on the alert to wait at the railroad station, and they were caught and killed. Many of my friends were among them. And if it hadn't been for a good friend in my camp that kept my girlfriend and me from joining them, I wouldn't be here to tell you about it. We marched and we marched and we marched that night. I thought they were going to march us to death. Well, they found a new camp for us and new hard labor, ridiculous labor, but very, very hard. My shoes had worn out, and I was issued a pair of shoes with a wooden sole and very rough tops, and we no longer could wash our bodies, nor could we wash our clothes, and my black wool socks were filled with dirt, and I had rubbed a blister on my heel from the rubbing of these very, very hard, stiff shoes. And we didn't even have Band-Aids, so dirt got in, and pretty soon I started to feel feverish. The lymph glands in my groin started swelling, And my foot started turning color, and I knew I had wild infection. But I couldn't even permit myself to limp, because if the Nazis, the guards would have seen that I was limping, they would have known that I'm not fit to work. And the Nazi mentality was, if you aren't fit to work, kill him. Either torture them to death or kill them on the spot. And even though I knew my ultimate destination would be Auschwitz, there was that hope inside that I might live. Well, it worked. The hope worked. We were marching to work one day. It was, to be exact, the 10th of February, 1945. We saw the villagers fleeing, and they were in a hurry. They were running. The wagons were piled high, pulled by horses, piled high with their belongings. Their livestock was tied behind it. It was just utter chaos. And we stopped out of the line one time, and we asked somebody, and they said, the Russians are coming. They're so immensely close. Haven't you noticed there's a roaring in the distance? Yeah, we had heard that. We didn't know what it was all about. We had no newspapers, no radio. And sure enough, the evening sky was lit up at the horizon, bright red. We could smell it. We could feel the vibrations beneath us, and we could hear the roaring, and it was coming closer. That night, the women's camp was locked up so tight that nobody would have been able to escape. And there were 5 of us girls that had grown very close to each other and close to each other through Christ. We loved him. And we prayed all that night that if it was God's will, would he deliver us out of the hands of our persecutors? Well, we knew that it would take a mighty miracle, but we are the children of a king that specializes in miracles. Well, the next morning came, but during the night too, we looked through these dirty little windows in the place where we were hovering together, and we could see our guards marching around our camp all night long, carrying bayonets and rifles over their shoulders, so we didn't know what was waiting for us the next day. Well, the next morning came, it was the crack of dawn. We were all forced to climb on horse-drawn carts that were chauffeured by Polish prisoners of war that worked as slaves on German farms. The men were held behind, and one of my friends, her husband, was kept behind, and she just totally fell apart. And we were whisked off. A couple or 3 of our guards were following us on bicycles, and of course it was winter, February 11. And the head honcho of the camp, Mr. Anders, he looked like a pit bull and he acted like one. He stood behind with the men, and we didn't know what's going to happen to them. Well, it was a long, cold ride, and all of a sudden we could see through the early morning dawn a complex of barracks, and in the middle of it was a smokestack that was going into heaven, and the whole complex was surrounded by barbed wire fences that were electrically loaded. We knew what that was. We didn't realize there were that many camps littering the countryside. That morning, my friends, and I'm not going into detail because the book is available downstairs for $10, and the book tells it all. I have more to share with you. That morning, the Lord performed a miracle of miracles. It just overwhelms me. Sometimes I read it on the 11th of February every year. I celebrate. And when I reread it each year, it just boggles me how this was happening. Well, when we were far, far away from our persecutors, close to Berlin, 2 girls went one way and 3 of us went another way. And on our way, we passed through the Dresden, where we experienced the famous firestorm, the bombing of Dresden. And I was too weak and too sick to go to the air raid shelter. And we were in a suburb outside Dresden, a little country railroad station. And the siren had blown. Everybody was headed for the air raid shelter. My friends did. They wanted to carry me down there. I said, no, leave me out here. I'll stay out here. And I witnessed the whole spectacle all night long. It was horrible. And I thought it was a miracle that a bomb didn't go astray and hit me. And my friends were amazed that I was still alive. Well, then we went on the next day to a city of Bautzen in the province of Saxony, and not too far from Dresden. And there I had to be hospitalized, and all hospitals were operated by Nazis. And there was a shortage on doctors and nurses because most of them were at the battlefront. And I was received by a Nazi nurse that day. She wore the sticker pin, and he greeted us with a Heil Hitler. And she rambled on about this wonderful leader of our country. I felt like throwing up into her face. I had one thing going for myself. I had naturally blonde hair. I looked like a typical Aryan girl. I looked like my father's side of the family. They were all blondes. And nobody would have guessed I had an ounce of Jewish blood in my veins. I was proud of my Jewishness, but for once it did help. And she thought I was just another German girl. I didn't say where I came from, nothing. And my friends left that evening, and it was so nice to lie between clean sheets. And the food was usually bread and jam and maybe a little soup, but to me it was a filet mignon compared to the food in the camp. Like I said, there was a shortage on doctors, so the doctor didn't come right away, and they didn't know what they were going to do with me because there was no antibiotic. A foot full of pus and fever, a very high fever. So finally the doctor came. She was a young lady doctor, and she was horrified, and she said, well, no antibiotic, what can we do? So she said, well, we'll operate. We will drill some holes, 2 holes on the outside of your foot, and put tubes in there and put some black ointment called Ixtaman, and we will put that on and see if we can draw the infection out. But under the ether anesthesia, which was given to me by that Nazi nurse, I must have spoken from my subconsciousness, because when I woke up, the nurse said, my, but did that little girl ever talk a lot? And sure enough, her attitude toward me changed. She was no longer kind. She became sadistic. And as I said, you see, there was a medal for every Nazi that killed a Jew. And she took that upon herself. So here, I was at the mercy of a Nazi nurse that wanted to kill me. No antibiotic. And what happened was, you see, there was an open wound or 2 open wounds. And so she permitted the bandages to get infected and dirty, and more pus developed, and my fever started rising again. And by chance, the doctor came, because the nurse tried to keep the doctor away from me. And the doctor said, oh, we'll have to put more holes into the foot. So they drilled holes into the inside of the foot, put more tubes in, and pretty soon I could tell that I developed a lump in my upper thigh and the inside of my upper thigh, and it grew. And I would tell this nurse, there's something in there. And she'd say, oh yeah, she said, you're just a little pansy. You should marry a doctor when you grow up. And I knew what she was trying to do. Here was at the mercy of her. Well, she tried to keep the doctor away, but finally the doctor came, and she was horrified when she saw this. So evidently the doctor was not a Nazi, or she would have let me die. So she said she was going to cut that long, this wide and real deep into the upper thigh, and put tubes in, several tubes in, and then put that ointment on again and wrap it up, hoping that that will do the trick. Well, now what I'm going to tell you is going to gross you out, because I hope you've digested your meal. Because it's ugly, and when I tell this in school, the kids sometimes look kind of blank when I talk about a bedpan. They don't know what that is. But anyway, she gave me an enema. She saw the open wound so close, you see, and she would give me an enema and leave me there on the bedpan for 2 hours, and all the feces and all the urine ran into that open wound, into the tubes, and caused more of an infection. And pretty soon, another lump formed in my thigh, and my fever was rising over 104. I was somewhat delirious, but the Lord always kept me tuned to what was going on. Well, my girlfriend came again, and she saw this, and so by night, she went to the young doctor's apartment, and she pleaded with her to come and see me. And the doctor said, what? She said, the nurse kept telling me that your friend is doing well, that she's getting well. Yeah, she said, I believe that she did, but it's not true. She's just keeping you away. And the doctor had to be very careful what she was doing. But she found a way to reroute the nurse into another department at the hospital where she said you were badly needed, to keep her away from me. And this time she consulted another doctor. And so they enlarged that cut at the top of the inside of my thigh, and then they cut another one above the knee. And the little one was like this, and the other one like that, and this long and real deep. And then they dug a passage underneath with a special new instrument. And they gave me very little hope that they could let me keep my leg, because they said they're digging that close to a main artery. And if they would slip up, my leg would have to come up right by the groin. And I was 17, and for sheer vanity, I wasn't too crazy about that idea. But also, I came to realize, Lord, I said, how could I outrun the Nazis or the Germans if I had to? How could I ever find my mother again? But God remained faithful. And the next day, the nurse that would give me the ether was gone, and another nurse who didn't know anything about me gave me the anesthesia. And they always gave me just enough to put me slightly under. I couldn't feel too much, but I could hear things. And I woke up on the operating table, and they were bandaging my leg. And I couldn't believe it that I still had my leg. And you can imagine the pain, but I thought they were phantom pains. But no, I had my leg, and I just praised the Lord silently. I couldn't believe that He was that merciful to me, a sinful human being. Oh, He is so good to us naughty children. Sometimes it's great. Anyway, I thank the Lord. And there were no aspirin. I had to endure the pain, but I'm very blessed with a very high pain threshold. God knew what He was doing. At one point, when I was recuperating, finally, I still had all the tubes in there. My friend asked me to remove my bandage, and they had crepe paper bandages. And she saw this. She said, how can God do this to you? Doesn't He know how much you love Him? I said, hey, don't blame the Lord. It's people's doing. I said, God never makes a mistake. I guarantee you someday those wounds are going to be my protection. And I reminded her of Romans 8:28. All things work together for good. I said to her, all things. And I know these wounds are going to be my protection someday. And she thought I was crazy. Well, after 6 weeks flat on my back, I still had the tubes in it, but I was allowed to get up and walk. Well, I had no crutches. I had no cane. My friend steadied me, helped me to walk again, and I walked with help. I had lost my equilibrium. I lost all my muscle. I had to start walking all over again like a little baby. I worked feverishly. On the fourth day, the sirens howled. All the patients were taken to the air raid shelter. A fierce battle had started. The Russians were coming to town. It was horrible. We were very crowded, 3-4 people in one bed, and men, women, and children all in one room. And pretty soon the Russians had captured the town, and they came in. They took our food that was in the next room. They took our kerosene lamps. They just left us little candles, and they started raping women. And at one point, they pulled me off my cot. There were 2 Russian soldiers in leather coats and heavy boots, reminded me of the Gestapo. They picked me up, threw me on a mattress, ripped off all my clothes, and I was laying there with them staring at me. And I knew what they were going to do to me. I was one of those wacky 17-year-old girls that had hardly ever even kissed a guy, let alone to have that happen. And inwardly, I just prayed for God's mercy. And everyone was looking on. It was just like a scene out of hell. And when they saw my big bandage that was slightly bloodstained, they thought maybe I was faking, and they called a student nurse to unwrap it. And do you know when she unwrapped that last bit of that bandage, the pus squirted out like a geyser out of those wood. And I grossed these guys out so much, they took off and ran. here it was. What I had predicted to my friends, someday these wounds are going to be my protection. And ever thereafter, my friends, when I encountered rape, and it wasn't only from the Russians, there were some American soldiers that I saw later on. But each time, those horrible wounds were my protection, and God always delivered me out of their hands in the nick of time. So I praise the Lord. And to this day, when I look at these ugly scars, and as I've gotten older, you know, things don't get any prettier. And yeah, little blue veins that look like buttonhole stitch come to it. But anyway, to me, they're my beauty marks. They remind me daily of God's greatness, our undeserved love, and the wonderful miracles. And that's why I say, I thank the Lord for those times, because it brought me into a much closer fellowship with my Lord. It has intensified my faith and my trust in Him. So when you are in trouble and you go through a lot of sorrow, whatever the hardship, remember, God has not pushed you away or forgotten you. He is testing your faith. This is how we grow. Well, it was a hard time, but a time that I don't mind remembering and talking about. I had a chance during a pause in fighting to witness to that nurse. I was walking to the outer hall, not thinking about anything, and there in the dim light of my candle that I was carrying was that nurse sitting on a floor on a mattress, weeping profusely. I knew the Lord was leading me out there to witness to her, to comfort her. I couldn't. I started to even argue with him, how could you do this to me? I mean, telling him all the awful things she did to me, as if he didn't know that already. But at that moment, I felt so ashamed of myself, because at that moment, I had that vision of seeing him on the cross, hanging there, suffering much worse than what I had to suffer. And I knew he didn't just die for me only. He died for her too. I said, Lord, I know you want me to comfort her, but I can't. I'm mad and I'm bitter and everything. But if you want me to comfort her, take that bitterness out of my heart and put your love into it instead. And then I will be able to do it. And he did that. But without his help, I couldn't do it. I'm just not that good. None of us are. I knelt down beside her on the mattress and I put my arm around her, and on my shoulder she laid and she wept. She shook with sobs. And between sobs, she conveyed to me that she had been raped many times. I wept with her because I realized what I had been spared from. And all of a sudden, she pushed herself away from me. She said, how could you show me love and concern? Don't you realize that I tried to kill you? I said, oh, yes, I know. But I said, Christ died for me. Christ died for me. He died for you too. And I have asked him to help me to forgive you, and I do. Well, temporarily the Russians were driven out of the city, and all ambulatory patients were sent to the mountains to be evacuated from the fighting. I don't know what happened to the nurse. And one fine day, they took out the tubes for my leg, and they told me, time for you to go home. We need your bed. And I remember it was close to Hitler's birthday. It must have been about the 18th of April. I'd been there now for a little over 8 weeks. I didn't have any crutches. I didn't have a cane. The Lord steadied me. He became my crutch. And I stood out there that morning and they said, yeah, go home. I don't have a home. And I spoke to the Lord, and it was as if he was saying to me, wherever I'm with you, that's where your home is going to be. He did not permit for me to go on a smooth journey by any means. I went on a very, very difficult journey. The book is very condensed. Jan, by the way, had a wonderful gift to condense the book. Yes, sometimes he permits for us to go on a very thorny journey with a lot of hurdles, but he's with us every step of the way. And he was. And finally the war was over and I was on the American side, and I was glad that I was now finally somewhat safe. I secured a passport that would help me to go through Czechoslovakia because that's where my mother's camp was. I had heard that the Russians had liberated that camp, so the Russians weren't all bad. They liberated many of our camps. And I knew that I would be setting myself up for another very difficult and dangerous journey because the Czechs hated the Germans. I looked German. I spoke mostly German. I remembered a little school English. And I didn't know how I was going to get there. So again, one morning with a passport in my pant pockets, all I had left was what I had on my body and what I had in my pant pockets. Everything else was gone. All over, all the times, in camp, out of camp, my journeys. There was always somebody that had less than I did. I had 2 pairs of socks, and God prompted me to give away 1 pair, and so forth, until I was stripped down to just what I had on my body, a pajama top and a pair of ski pants. Not exactly Dior fashion. I set out that morning on the 6th of June, months after the liberation, and I said, I don't know, Lord, you show the way, you take me. Somebody advised me, they said, well, just pretend to be a deaf mute. And my friends who know me well, they know that for me to pretend to be a deaf mute, it would take another miracle. One of my friends is sitting right over there. One of my German friends, not she, but another one calls me a Schnattergans. Somebody that knows German knows what it means. Well, God helped me. I hitchhiked. And when I was on the last stretch of my journey, I was on a little train. And I was sitting in a rather dark train compartment. And all of a sudden, I felt behind me a man's hand on my shoulder, and he talked to me, which I presumed was Czech. And then he came around, sat down with me, and in the dim light, he stared at me and saw my blonde hair, and he said, Niemetz, which means German, but not a very complimentary term. And I shook my head and I said, no, I'm not. And I said that in English. Oh, he said, Amerikanski? Well, I thought if he knows English, he'll find out I'm not Amerikanski at all. And then I had just enough time to show him my passport, which stated in 3 different languages, Czech, Russian, and English, that I was a victim of Nazism, that I had been incarcerated and was en route to Theresienstadt. And then his eyes softened and filled with tears, and he hugged me. And in a somewhat broken German, he said, I am a Jew too. I have just come back from a concentration camp. I have been incarcerated for many, many years. I lost my entire family. He said, I live in Prague. I will walk with you. I will talk for you. And I will try to help you to find a train to Theresienstadt or something. He did. He stuck with me. He helped me. And then he introduced me to a young Czech police officer with a jeep, gave him money, gave me some money, and there was a small crowd of people. And when I turned around and I wanted to thank him, it was just like he vanished out of sight. And I said to my new escort, I said, I think I just saw another angel. And the young man that was supposed to drive me to my mother's camp spoke some German, and he said, well, I just hope that the same God that sends you angels will have kept your mother alive. We drove over rubble and rubble, the after effects of war, signs of man's inhumanity. And when we came to the camp, finally, we saw the big brick walls that surrounded the camp, iron gates that were patrolled by Russian police. They had their orders not to let anybody in, and there was a poster with a skull and the crossbones stating camp under quarantine, entrance forbidden. And I'd heard about the typhoid epidemic, but it was all cleaned up. But they had their orders not to let me in. And so my escort pleaded with them, and finally they let me in. Then I ascended the steps of the building where I would find out if my mother had survived. I became a real coward. I wanted to run, but God gave me strength to go in. And the lady that was in charge there looked in the file of the survivors, and she could not find my mother's name. You can imagine how I felt. But she said, listen, I'm going into another room. I will be looking at other files. And it took 10 minutes. And those were the longest 10 minutes that I ever waited. She came back with a smile and she said, Hilda Dittmann has survived. She's okay. And she showed me directions on how to get there because this camp was so large, it was like a small city. And when I came face to face with my mother on June 7th in the afternoon, we were just almost in shock. And then we wept and we shared. And she told me that it was a miracle that she stayed alive. And she told me the horrors of her camp time. And we witnessed for the Lord. And there were 5 Jewish ladies that shared the room with her. And they were opening their ears and listening to our message. Soon after that, or a few weeks after that, there were thousands of us that were transported by military trucks to Bavaria, to a refugee camp. We could not go to England. We established contact with my sister, but the British were so impoverished they couldn't receive new residents. So we signed up with the ACCR, the American Christian Committee for Refugees, and they sponsored our trip. So again, June 7th, 1946, 900 of us embarked the SS Marine Flasher, a troop ship that we sailed for about 11 days to reach America. And on the day before, on that night, all us young people stayed on the top of the deck. We were going to be the first ones to see the Statue of Liberty, but it was a foggy night. But everybody was on deck the next morning, and I tell you, there was no dry eye. There was utter silence, and that was only broken by sobs of relief, sobs of gratitude to our God, who finally made our dream come true, to be free. It was a glorious day. Soon our organization brought us to Manhattan to the Diplomat Hotel. And then the next day they gave us a choice. We could either stay in New York and they find work for us, or else go to Sky Island in Nyack, New York, where we stayed in a beautiful chalet castle almost that was donated by a wealthy Jewish family for refugees to have a time of rest. And there we stayed for 2 months. And then our organization consented that there was a family there that took us under their wings, a widow with their 3 grown children. And they brought us to the Middle West, to Iowa, where I had a chance to go to school, to go to college. And ultimately, later on, I became a teacher. I got married. I had 2 children, a boy and a girl. I put my application in early, so I got 1 of each. And they both live in the Twin Cities. In fact, I'm here also to celebrate my daughter's birthday and my son's daughter's birthday, my oldest granddaughter, who will get married in, I think it was the 15th of December. So that is the end of my story. And thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Nobody slept. Thank you for your attentiveness and for your response. And God bless you. And I hope you all have a safe journey home. I don't know if we have time for the Schnattergans talked a long time, I'm afraid. You do.
So Aaron had ordered this, and actually just Monday or so I watched it and I said, you know what? To be honest, on last Sunday, that's what I was trying to communicate to everyone. That, you know, yeah. Yes, God does care. She lost everything. But yet, did she? And I also think of Job, all the things that he lost, but yet God was faithful in it all. Tremendous testimony of the faithfulness of God and how he protected her. Now, I'll say this, Were there other Christians that died? Yeah, sure. Yet she survived, and I believe for a purpose. Because of that, her testimony of the faithfulness of God, sharing it. What a tremendous testimony. And to be very honest, for me, what a blessing it is to hear that. And could it happen here in America? We'll see. We'll see. And I think we need to, as not just this church, but churches all over America, we need to realize a lot of things that are going on in this world, but yet God will stay faithful in it all. No matter what happens, He'll stay faithful. Let's just close in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this testimony. And Lord, we just pray that in our lives, that we would realize that, Lord, you care. You're faithful. And Lord, that we don't need to give up on those that we know that are lost, but we need to pray for them too, that they might be saved. And Lord, with this testimony, we just give you all the honor, we give you all the glory, and we do pray these things in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.
It's a different New York now. I can stand up. And now you're a little dry. Oh, it's not very long. Well, it seemed long to me when I finally found you. Okay, that's good.
See y'all.
Take care. Bye, Red. See you guys later. See you later. Have a good night. No.